Good morning, everybody, from Victoria College in the University of Toronto. I'm Robert Austin from the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs. I decided today to give this introduction from one of my classrooms. I'm still teaching in a class. Unfortunately, the students aren't there, but I still need the feel of a classroom. So that's what sits behind me a few days a week here. Today is a really great day, everybody, and I'll tell you why. We don't just have good weather, but it's a real treat for me to talk about two really special people, Daniel Damov and Ivan Krastev. They're not just both from Bulgaria, everybody, but they're really, really good friends of mine, and I value immensely the friendship we've developed over the past few years. But before I formally introduce Ivan as our esteemed guest for today's lecture, I'd like to say a few words about the series that we're talking about today, and that's why we're hosting Ivan. This is the Daniel and Elizabeth Damov Lecture in European Affairs. And it's sponsored by a really long and dear friend, not just of Sarah's in the University of Toronto, but as I said, one of my close and dear friends in Toronto. And Dan and Elizabeth and his wife passed away, unfortunately, have always been really enthusiastic and generous supporters of the programming that's taken place at our center, Sarah's, at the Munk School. We started together the Bulgarian Studies program, which is a small program, but it's really dynamic. We started with student exchanges, we had visiting scholars, and then we launched the Distinguished Leaders in Bulgaria lecture series. Not surprisingly, Ivan Krastev was probably, I think, our foundational speaker in that series. And Ivan, I remember so fondly some of the great visits we've had with you in Toronto that we were just talking about, and I look forward to hosting you again in Toronto and in future on any subject you ever want to talk about, that is. Thanks to Mr. Damov for having this visionary series. It's really incredible. The focus of the lecture, everybody, is Europe, and it's big picture Europe. That's when Dan and I conceived the series, and it was a long series of discussions. It has a special meaning because it reflects the origins and beliefs of Mr. and Mrs. Damov. They met in France and they studied together, they got married, they obviously made a life in Canada, but the two of them had this incredible passion for things Europe, and both coming, again, Dan was from Bulgaria and Elizabeth was from France, but they shared this common vision of what Europe could become. And they met at this, it's really interesting for Dan and Elizabeth, everybody, they met at this, this foundational meeting of the College of Europe. Ivan, I'm sure you know the story, in Bruges. And there's Dan, who had fled communist Bulgaria. Elizabeth, as I said, was from Germany. And Dan, I remember Dan telling me that these two young people there in this, this moment of rebuilding Europe, and they were kind of guinea pigs for what Europe could become. And I think that moment, again, they obviously made a terrific couple together, but it shaped their ideas, and it has an impact that continues through the years, especially in the center's activities. Dan and Elizabeth became, of course, great Canadians and a huge contribution here, but they also remained really committed to their roots in Europe. And they were really firm believers in the power of European integration and the promise of peace and prosperity. I want to note especially that Elizabeth was really proud of the role that the Federal Republic of Germany played after the war in building a common European home. And that's one of the messages that we give today, is about integration. And in my countless discussions with Dan, ladies and gentlemen, he saw the lecture series as a way to honor their commitment to a new Europe and to educate others about Europe and its great achievements, particularly after the Second World War. This is the third in our series, everybody. We hosted Christian Lecain from Sciences Po in 2019. That, by the way, was a live lecture. And then we hosted Constanze Stelzenmüller from the Brookings Institution just this fall, largely focused on transatlantic relations, everybody. And now this is our third. I want to say something special for Dan. I've known Dan for more than 20 years, as I said. My friendship with him is something I really cherish. He is an extraordinary person who serves really as a role model to all of us. And I find him quite inspirational. Dan, Mr. Damov, thank you so much for the support you provide us and for the wonderful friendship you've given me over these past 2 decades. Now, I want to say a few words about Ivan Krastev, who's also a very special person. I met Ivan. Ivan, I was thinking about this, since time is so strange these days. I think I met you when we were working on a Stability Pact project, and we would have met in Budapest when Bodo Hombach was head of the Stability Pact. And I remember hearing a speech from Ivan and thinking, wow, that guy's really smart. And then we had a social evening that night in a restaurant off Váci utca in Budapest, as I recall. And I thought, not only is Ivan a smart guy, he's also a very funny guy and he's a very nice guy. And this is a tremendous combination. You can't ask for something better in a friend. As you know, as already said, Yvonne's a regular visitor here at the University of Toronto, and we're very proud of that. And when I told Dan, by the way, that you were going to be the speaker for the 2021 event, you can imagine only how proud and how delighted he was that you are our speaker joining us here in March 2021. So a few other things about Yvonne. His credentials should be known to all of you, especially if you read the New York Times or any other leading papers. I love when his email comes on his list and I get a piece that I can read, because I always find it sometimes counterintuitive, sometimes intuitive, but always everybody extremely enlightening. And my students are tremendous fans. In addition to being chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, which by the way is my all-time favorite think tank, and its impact is palpable, and everybody knows the role that the CLS has played in Bulgaria and elsewhere in the region. But he's also a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, which is another partner of Sarah's. If you're not getting the IWM newsletter, iwm.at, you're missing something, because it's a tremendous publication. He's also a founding member of the European Council on Foreign Relations, a member of the Board of Trustees of the International Crisis Group, and as I said, a contributing writer for the New York Times. His most recent book, which I just finished, is It Tomorrow Yet? How the Pandemic Changes Europe. I recommend it highly. It's a quick read, and he makes a lot of fascinating conclusions. Closer to home, you'll recognize that he just published The Light That Failed, A Reckoning, which he wrote with Stephen Holmes, which won our very own Gelber Prize here in Toronto. So Yvonne's visit was more or less about a year ago now, I think, Yvonne, or maybe around this time. But the Gelber Prize is the highest book honor that we do in partnership with the Monk School. Today is a really important lecture. Demography matters a lot, Yvonne. My students are constantly talking about it. We're talking about how it impacts particularly the Balkans, but also Central Europe. I'm not going to say any more. I said I would talk to 11:07. It's now 11:08, so I've gone over. Yvonne, you know, the floor, as they say in these Zoom meetings, the virtual floor is yours, but it gives me an extraordinary amount of pleasure to welcome you to Toronto, but particularly for the Daniel and Elizabeth Damov Lecture in European Affairs. My thanks, and I'm looking forward to your talk. We'll catch up at the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you a lot. And I also should confess that for me, this is something very special and very personal. Probably for the first time, I came to Toronto somewhere 20 years ago. And since then, all my visits are connected with seeing Robert and Mr. Damov. I have a very also warm remembrance of Elizabeth. And this was something which was part of my intellectual biography. The university, the students, the conversations, all this being together, and also seeing Mr. Damov in Sofia. So when I got the invitation, I was really moved. I'm also slightly sad, honestly speaking, because I don't like lecturing on Zoom, and I should start with this, and I'll try to keep it 30, 35 minutes, because after this 1 year of COVID, I realized three things. First, how important traveling is for our experience of freedom. Not how we are defining freedom, but how we were experiencing. And probably this is part of somebody who was born in 1965, and 1989 was a key year in my life. But this kind of a pleasure of crossing borders without purpose, basically without noticing borders, is something that I found so important for understanding that I'm free. Secondly, talking about movements and talking about migration, and we're going to talk about this in our conversation, I just want to mention that probably we're seeing one of the biggest migrations in history of the world, and this is the migration from the physical to the virtual world. I was really surprised how quickly almost 1 billion of people moved, teaching, working, and doing things from a physical world, from the classrooms like the one in which Robert is sitting now, to these computers. But the reason I don't like talking on Zoom are three, and they're very simple. One is there is no place for jokes in the Zoom lectures, because you're making jokes in order to hear people laughing. Even if you're going to make a joke, the only thing that you can do is hear yourself laughing, which is not the best that can happen to a lecturer. Secondly, on Zoom, you understand how repetitive you are. Because normally when you see different people, different type of example is going to come to you. Certain type of idea is going to be provoked, not simply by the questions, but by the faces of the people with whom you're discussing. You don't have this so much on Zoom. And thirdly, which is interesting, the colleagues from Stanford have come with the idea of Zoom exhaustion, and they defined one of the important elements that make people exhausted with Zoom is the fact that you are watching yourself. Your picture is there. You're basically watching yourself in a certain way. You are the audience of your own lecture, and this is kind of something strange. So confessing that Zoom lectures is not the thing that I really like, in order to make it nice and also trying to make it more special because of Mr. Downworth and Robert, I decided not to give you a talk on type of a work that I have already finished, but much more share some arguments, ideas, and hypotheses about something that I'm working on. And if everything is fine, basically, it should end up as a book probably till the end of this year. And I'm going to have also a course of lectures in Collège de France in the autumn on this story of democracy and demography under the title The Fear of Shrinking Numbers. And here's the story. In democracy, number matters. Normally, in a classical democratic narrative, you're going to hear that government change when people change their minds, but also government can change because the population has changed. And this can happen because a kind of a new generation with a kind of a strong collective preferences is entering politics. What happened in many Western countries after 1968, it was a big generation and it changed politics. It can happen because a new group of people suddenly joined the body politics. For example, this happened in Israel, where after the end of the Soviet Union, almost 1 million Soviet Jews joined the country. It happened in Germany during the German unification. So from this point of view, the number of people and how you're defining the people and whom you're inviting and whom you're integrating is of incredible importance. In a certain way, I'm going to claim that when basically governments decide to whom to give citizenship or not, one of the questions which quite often is on the back of their mind is trying to imagine for whom these people are going to vote. And it was enough to basically watch the last American elections to understand how important the demographic change is. So when President Trump was complaining all the time that the elections have been rigged, the things that he basically wanted to say was not that the ballots have been falsified, but that the wrong people were allowed to vote. And this is critically important because, and this comes the demographic interest of the focus of my lecture, is because Europe is facing a very interesting and important demographic dilemma, and the nature of the different natures of demographic anxieties in the East and West of Europe probably is going to allow us better to understand this kind of a confrontation between liberal and illiberal, which is so typical for talking about Central and Eastern Europe. And when I'm going to talk about Central and Eastern Europe as a kind of a East, still I try to make one very important footnote, which is quite well known to all of you because you're studying European politics and history, but which normally people tend to ignore. And the point is the following: because these countries have been under communist rule for 50 years together, seen from outside, particularly people who are not studying them carefully, tend to believe that they're very similar. But this kind of a collection of small and medium-sized countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and I'm going to focus on the countries within the European Union, they're really very different. Poland, for example, is one of the countries with the highest level of church attendance in the European Union. But the Czech Republic is the society in Europe which has the high level of people who are going to define them agnostics when it comes to their religious beliefs. The nature of the economy, the nature of even social life, many things are common, but many things are different. So when I'm going to talk about the East, I'm trying to talk about certain commonalities, but we should really keep in mind that it's a very diverse, it's a really very diverse region. So in order to make my presentation kind of easier to structure, I'll start with something that Brecht wrote back in 1943. So Bertolt Brecht, the famous German poet communist, after the anti-communist riots in 1953, wrote a poem which was called The Solution. And the reason he wrote the poem was that the union of the East German writers said that the government is very disappointed by the people, how it happened that the workers are protesting against the worker state. So in his poem Solution, Brecht said, listen, if the government is so disappointed with the people, why the government does not decide to dissolve the people and to elect a new one? And this is a classical kind of a Brechtian paradox, but the truth is that the government's always trying to elect the people. And they're electing the people by the way they are designing the migration legislation. They're electing the people by designing election laws. So from this point of view, my starting point is that in order to understand the difference between liberalism and illiberalism in Europe, probably we should be not so much interested how people elect the government, but try to understand what kind of people the governments wants to elect. And this is going to be one of the fundamental differences. And these fundamental differences has a lot to do with the demographic anxieties and demographic fears in Europe as a whole, but particularly Central and Eastern Europe. Democracy and demography is not a new subject. Everybody who is interested in counting votes is interested in population, but normally in political science, democracy and demography have been discussed in Malthusian terms. Always the fear was that there are going to be too many people and there are not going to be enough resources. And there was a lot of studies that have been done, particularly on the impact of a very young populations, for example, in the Middle East countries during the Arab Spring and how they're shaping and influencing democratic politics or the lack of democratic politics. The interesting story about Eastern Europe and Europe as a whole is that the problem in Eastern Europe is not population growth. The problem in Europe is population decline. Eastern Europe is the part of the world which has the highest decline of population. For the last 30 years, the countries in Central and Eastern Europe has lost 18 million people, which is, if it was a country which is going to be as big as Hungary and Czech Republic taken together. The process of demographic decline didn't start in 1989. It started much earlier. It started in the 1970s. This was the demographic transition is studied much better than the democratic transitions. But what is interesting about Central and Eastern Europe and what is important for these 30 years and some of the projects on which I want to touch is the following. In Central and Eastern Europe, you have low fertility rates, but these low fertility rates you can see also in many of the West European countries, for example, Italy. For example, in 2018, 200 schools had been closed in Poland because there was no kids for the schools, but the year 2018 was also the year in which basically the fertility, this was kind of the worst year from the demographic point of view, starting with 1861 for Italy. So what is important and what is very different between Western and Eastern Europe is not the level of the fertility rate, but this is basically the combination of low fertility and out-migration that you have in Central and Eastern Europe. In many of these European countries, the period after 1989 and the opening of the borders was very much characterized by the fact that 10 to 15% of the population left the country. And many of these people are younger people. For example, 70% of the people who left Romania for the last 10 years are people younger than 40. This kind of a major out-migration creates four types of problems for the East European societies, which was not very much discussed till recently, and particularly till the migration crisis. And the reasons they were not discussed is that opening of the borders was the best and in a certain way the worst thing that happened to Central and Eastern Europe. It was the best thing because all of us, and I can imagine that even some of you who basically are part of this conversation and are listening to this lecture, have been coming from our countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and the fact that you can travel, you can study abroad, you can work abroad, you realize yourself on individual level. This was the way we most benefited from the end of the communist regime. But from point of view of certain countries, of course, it was extremely, extremely problematic, because the loss of population was also very much combined with the aging of the population. And this put a huge pressure on the economic system. And this pressure goes, and the general impact of migration in four different ways that I'm going to now to develop in front of you. The first is very much that not simply people are living, all the money invested in them, in their education, are living with them. Italian researcher Federico Fubini made a calculation and said, basically, the money that had been invested in the education of the Central and East Europeans who emigrated to Western Europe is quite comparable to the money that had been transferred from the West to the East in the years of European integration. So this kind of a human capital, social capital, but basically, and this creates a paradox, because the more the countries are going to invest in their education, the higher the quality of their labor force and the more demand for them it is. Because in Western Europe itself, where also the population is aging, there was a much vacancies in certain sectors, there was a huge demand for this East European labor. And during the pandemic, this was very clear. I'm just going to give you two figures in order to understand part of the things that we're talking about. For example, Eastern Europe is the place where quite a lot of medical universities are functioning and quite good medical education exist on a kind of acceptable price. So in Hungary in 2018, 1,200 young people graduated from medical universities and become medical doctors. But the same year, 950 Hungarian doctors left and started working abroad. So when the COVID came, in many of the Central and East European countries, there was incredible deficit of doctors and nurses. The average age of the Bulgarian nurses was 52 years. And the same was with the doctors, about 50. So you can imagine to what kind of risk some of these people have been exposed, particularly in the early days of the pandemics, when 60, 70-year-old doctors were going to treat the patients without basically knowing how to protect themselves and really risking dying, and many of these people died. So this is the first, the transfer of money. The second is the major generational disbalance. Because of the low fertility rates, in general, basically the young people are a smaller and smaller group in the general composition of the population. And because this is the group that is also much easier and much more ready to leave the country, you have a certain type of a bias on the level of the decision making, of the level of seeing the problems of the world through a much more aging population. So this is not by accident that it was so difficult, for example, to reform the pension system in many of our countries, because the people who are voting are basically the people who are going to be pensioners, if not today, in 2, 3, 5 years' time. The third, what is happening is that it also very much changed the electoral body, because even when these people basically still keep their passports and have the right to vote, with some very few exceptions, when you basically leave the country, the turnout of the diaspora vote is much lower than the turnout of the people who are living in the country, for obvious reasons. And also some governments are doing even much more difficult, or trying to be very much selective to try to see how to mobilize and how to work with the people who are living outside of the country. I'm going to give the example with the Hungarian government, which gave Hungarian citizenship to the Hungarian minorities living in Slovakia or Serbia or Romania. And if you're a Hungarian citizen living in Transylvania, you have the right to vote by mail. But if you're a Hungarian citizen living in United Kingdom, and there are hundreds of thousands of Hungarians living in the United Kingdom, the only way for you to vote is by going to the embassy or to the special place where the voting is allowed. And one of the difference of this kind of this selective approach to the voters outside of the country is very much rooted in the fact that basically the voting patterns of these communities is quite different. While voters in Transylvania much more tend to support the current government in Budapest, many of the people who are in London basically are in London because they left, because they don't want to stay because of the government. So all these kind of changes on the electoral dynamics is very important, because one of the answers of the questions, what happened with the liberal voters in Central and Eastern Europe, the answer is they're simply in the West. Because this was kind of the central paradox of the 1989 revolution. The ideal was not a society that is going to be built in the future. The ideal was the society next to you. The East wanted to be like the West. And many people decided that they don't have time to waste in order to wait for Bulgaria to become like Germany. Is it not easily simply to go to Germany? So for those of you that know Hirschman and his exit voice dilemma, this is critically important to realize that because of the opening of the borders and because of our countries being part of the European Union, strangely enough, exit become the preferable option. And this also is one of the reasons why it became also working very much in the favor of the governments, which were going with a much more traditionalist and quite often Europeanly skeptical agenda. You're going to see, for example, that the pattern of voting of the people living outside of the country in general tends to be much more liberal than the one who are voting in the country. And this is quite interesting about East-West divide in Europe, because normally you're going to believe that when it comes to the political preferences, but also the value divides, this is the most important divide in Europe. But in fact, the most important divide of Europe is not East-West, and it's also even not North-South, which was provoked by the very much and exposed during the financial crisis. The biggest divide is what in America they call the density divide, the divide between the big metropolitan cities and the countryside and the rural areas. Urban-rural divide is really critically important. Why this migration, out-migration, is so important, and why I do believe it explains quite a lot. Because when the refugee crisis started and everybody started to try to make sense of a very different reaction that you have about migration in Western and Eastern Europe, and the paradox was that in Eastern Europe, you have a very strong anti-migrant sentiments. At the same time, there was no migrants. There's some people that were going through Bulgaria or through Hungary, but they were not staying. Where it comes from? It turned out that it is much more the trauma of out-migration, the fear of ethnic disappearance, the fear that these small nation and ethnic groups basically had the feeling that because of these low fertility rates and because of out-migration, they're going to disappear. That very much explains the support for some of the right-wing populist parties that were doing so well on the elections, at least till very recently. And this is not only Central and Eastern Europe. A study had been done during the European elections, and which shows that basically population decline, the number of the percent of the people that have left certain areas in the last 10 years is a better predicator how this region is going to vote when it comes, for example, for the alternative for Germany in Germany, than incomes or any type of a traditional indicators through which we're trying co-education, that we're trying to measure the support for the populist parties. So then where is this made? So if we decide to define liberalism and illiberalism as the ways, through the way that governments try to elect their people, what they want to elect. And here is the example. There is a restaurant in one of the wealthiest part of Vienna. It is Italian restaurant, but this is a strange Italian restaurant because it was created like an Italian restaurant, but then obviously it was not doing very well. So some person from Egypt bought the restaurant, and now it is an Italian restaurant with the Italian menu, and they have even Italian music in the restaurant, but there is not a single Italy connected people, neither the owner, nor the chef, nor the waiters have ever been to Italy. They don't speak Italian. And the question is this an Italian restaurant? Is it enough that the menu is Italian and the music is Italian? Is it an Italian restaurant if you cannot talk in Italian to anybody? And here, paradoxically, the liberal West and the illiberal East are going to give you a very different answer. A liberal German is going to say, yes, it is an Italian restaurant. Because the people working in the restaurant, they learn to cook an Italian food, and basically the waiters started learn kind of to explain what is in the dish. So you have a type of identity which is not based on origin, which is not ethnically based, but this is all the major characteristics are there. So we're talking to a type of national identity which is very inclusive and which is not very much based on where you come from, even the language that you speak, but the fact that you can cook and you can serve Italian way. For the East European, particularly for the East European populace, this is not an Italian restaurant, because a restaurant without Italians, it cannot be an Italian restaurant. And the major story for this populist party is that when we talk about majority and democracy, majority has two different meanings, like the two bodies of the king in the famous Kantarovich story. One is majority is the majority produced on the elections, but the other, it is the national ethnic majority, basically on which the national community is based. And for this type of political leaders, democracy makes sense only where there is a total, when basically the ethnic majority is represented in the political majority. This is why the fear of a declining ethnic numbers is so important. And this is why even when some of the East European countries are quite ready to open their markets for foreigners, they're not ready basically to give citizenship to these people. This is the real paradox of Central and Eastern Europe. While East European countries were strongly against, and they basically revolted against Brussels, against receiving 3, 5, up to 10,000, it depends on the country, refugees from Syria. At the same time, Poland and the Polish government, which is one of kind of a classical example of political illiberalism, Poland is the country that received most labor migrants of the EU member states for the last 3 years. And of course, most of these people are Ukrainians, and you're going to say this is because of the cultural similarities. But you're going to be surprised to know that there are also almost 20,000 Pakistanis, as Muslims as you get. The major differences, and this is the paradox at the heart of Eastern Europe, is that we can tolerate labor migrants, but we are not ready basically to accept refugees, because the most important is to keep the ethnic nature of the body politics. And from this point of view, when people are all the time saying, which is the model? Which is really the model these basically governments follow? And there was a talk about President Trump, and there was a talk about Russian President Putin. Listen, if you're a leader of a small country, you cannot imitate neither Putin nor Trump. The real model is Netanyahu's Israel, which is a quite diverse society, as you know. Some of them is a quite big Arab minority, but at the same time, you have by definition that states belongs to one of the ethnic groups. And secondly, which is critically important, is that nevertheless that you can integrate to a certain extent this coincidence, the fact that states belong to certain type of an ethnic group is very important. I'm saying this, and I will try to basically make only two additional points, is that this is not as strange as you look like, because paradoxically, the Zionism is one of the East European nationalisms. Most of basically Jewish community very much facing some of the East European interwar nationalism that had been very anti-Semitic, some of them, but this was the model that they were seeing. And here is one fact which I'm sure you know by history, but which is totally under-discussed in political science literature when it comes to Eastern Europe in the last 30 years. Normally people are going to tell you, listen, people are moving all the time. So now when we talk about migration, there was also a lot of migration in 20th century, not only in 21st century. But here's the experiment that I want to offer you. Imagine two ethnic maps. One is the ethnic map of Europe in year 1900. And what you're going to see is that there were two Europes. One was very much culturally diverse and religiously diverse, and this was the Central Europe, the Habsburg Europe. The other was much more ethnically homogenized, and this was Western Europe. It was France, it was Germany. If you go 100 years later, you're going to see that in the 20th century, all the movement of people, all the destruction of the wars, revolution, expulsion of the population, have been very much resulting in a very high level of ethnic homogenization in the East, while as the result of the decolonization in 60s and 70s, this kind of a wave had been reversed in the Western Europe. So in 1939, 1/3 of the population of Poland were not ethnic Poles. They had been Ukrainians, Germans, Jews. And then not because of their decision, but because of the wars, because of the expulsion of the Germans, the destruction of the Jews, the change of the borders with the Soviet Union. In 1990, more than 95% of the population of Poland had been ethnic Poles. The story of Hungary and basically the partition of Hungarians is also well known. So ethnic homogenization became critically important for the way the East European states have been created, and they have been legitimized. And this was true even the communist period. One of the reasons that makes somebody like Gomulka one of the few quite popular communists in the post-war Poland was the fact that he was the one of basically in charge of expelling the Germans. So saying this level of ethnic homogenization as the source of state building and understanding that democracy can function only in the ethnic homogeneous societies, the fact that ethnic diversity is connected to the imperial period and not to the nation state period, the fear that your nation state is starting to look like an empire if it opens you up, this is critically important to understand how and why Western Europe and Eastern Europe reacted so differently when it comes to this, what kind of people you want to choose. The paradox is also that what most of our governments are doing today is the thing that Germans did in the 1970s. And this only shows psychologically that the most unacceptable for you is somebody doing the thing that you are doing yesterday. Mainly, you're treating all these labor migrants that comes to your country as gastarbeiters. You're ready to tolerate for them to work, but you're not going to basically give them citizenship. You're not going to integrate them in society. A lot of literature has been put on how you integrated foreigners in a societies, and Canada is, of course, one of the greatest examples of this that wants basically to deal with diversity. But I'm going to end up saying what kind of a democracy this idea of ethnic state and ethnic democracy means, even if you decide to tolerate and opening the labor market for foreigners, whom you are going to allow to work, even you're going to give them social rights, but you are not going to give them possibility to vote. And here is the story that really interests me. Imagine in 20 years, if we see the current trends in place like Poland, where some people probably will continue to leave. By the way, the COVID-19 slightly changed these dynamics, and we have a group of quite big groups coming back to their countries, but they're going to be open more and more for the foreigners to come and work in Poland. But these people are not going to get the right to vote. You're going to have this strange democracy in which, for example, imagine 25, 30% of the labor force not having the right to vote. By the way, this is very much what you see in Vienna these days, where 30% of the people living in the city cannot vote on the Austrian elections, and 40% of the people has immigrant backgrounds. At the same time, you can have 10, 15% of the Poles who have the right to vote, but they're not paying taxes in Poland because they're living somewhere outside of Poland. And then you have the voters who are living in Poland and have the right to vote, but they're not working because many of them are on a retirement age and basically they're pensioners. So how you're going to govern, how democracy is going to govern if you have these three groups of people, basically how this mismatch between the market and democracy is going to work. And my story is that it can work only if some of the most important economic decisions are going to be taken out of the democratic politics. So in order to keep your democracy ethnically more homogeneous, the price that these governments are going to pay is that they should take many of the most important economic decisions outside of the electoral politics. And I do believe this kind of an illiberal dilemma is the dilemma that many people were not thinking about, because disconnections between democracy and demography was not very much at the center of the way the post-communist societies have been studied. And by the way, the demographic fears, this obsession that we are vanishing, we are losing numbers, this fear of shrinking numbers that I'm talking about, they explain other things too. For example, the totally paranoid anti-gay and anti-sexual minorities campaigns in certain countries. There are more than one explanations for them, but one is that these people are not going to produce kids. This kind of a pressure to put women back out of the labor market and to go home in order to have more kids, and all this kind of obsession with pronatalist policies, which honestly speaking historically never worked much anywhere. So this is the type of issues that are very interesting for me. And as I told you, I'm much more trying to map the territory that interests me than to give you the answers. But I'm wrong, but I always believe that coming with a good question from time to time is going to be more important than coming with an answer. Thank you very much. And I was slightly longer than I hoped.
Ivan, thank you very much. And hello again. I just want to mention before we go to the Q&A, in my class yesterday, we had the students, we were talking about Moldova, because I try in my classes to look at these, sometimes states that fall a little bit off our radar. And we also do a section on parastates. So we look at Transnistria, Abkhazia. But one thing that came up in Moldova, as you mentioned, was the incredible role that the people outside Moldova played in that recent election that got Maya Sandu into power. Because if it hadn't been for the Moldovans, and they have a huge demography problem, if it hadn't been for those people voting, then she probably wouldn't have won the election. She carried
same for Romania. Basically, the current Romanian president was very, very much elected because of the very high turnout. But Moldovan problem is really amazing. And there was a study that Tim Judah was putting also on how this migration statistics are done in many of these countries, particularly Western Balkans and Moldova. And it is so difficult because most of the Moldovians, in order to travel, they had a Romanian passports.
Mm-hmm.
So when you go there, many of them are going to be much more counted as the Romanian diaspora. And of course, this is a huge problem in the Balkans. And when I was talking about Central and Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, even it's much more radical. There are places like basically Bosnia and others where many people believe that the lack of basically the depopulation is the major political and developmental problem the country is facing.
Exactly. Yeah, and yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Tim Judah. I might put that in the chat box because Tim's done some terrific work. And The Guardian also has that series on demography where they look at Moldova, Hungary. It's part reportage, but also part video, and also these pro baby making campaigns, for lack of a better term, that Hungary's undertaken, especially in Poland, which, not sure of their prospect for success, but we can leave that. But Yvonne, I'm going to go to the questions now, okay? And I'll come back if it's necessary. But there's so many students here. And as I said, the students are really, I've already got a couple of questions. But Yvonne, before I forget, I just wanted to tell you something. In one of my classes, I know you like that quote from George Orwell, which is, all revolutions are failures. They're just not the same failure. This is an important thing that I carry with me all the time. And it's become the motto in one of my classes. So I'll say to the students, what's our motto? And that's it, because that's a real truism. But first, I'm going to go to one of my graduate students, Logan Borges, who's doing a master's here at our center. Yvonne, do you feel that this paradox is unique strictly to Central Eastern Europe? Can you see it potentially becoming as prevalent in Southern Europe as well, particularly Spain and Portugal, which also see similarly low fertility rates and immigration? Thank you, Logan, for that terrific question.
No, it is not. And in 2019, the European Council on Foreign Relations, for the first time, basically come with a survey in which we tried to measure not simply the fear of migration, which everybody was doing after the 2015 refugee crisis, but also the relations to out-migration. And you can see that Italy basically was behaving like Eastern Europe. And it appeared that Italians have been lost 1 million people for the last population and with a very low fertility rate. So losing your own, this exit revolution, turned out to politically could be much more important than basically all the talk about the people coming. So from this point of view, I don't believe this is particular to Central and Eastern Europe. There is one difference of Central and East European countries, and this is very much about the historical origin of these states. Most of the West European, but also South European states, they were former empires. They're going there. They have been, the states have been crossing borders, and this is one of the interesting things about Europe, and you can see it in the Balkans. In 20th century, quite often, the states were traveling much more than people. For example, this is the famous story of somebody who was born in Macedonia in the end of the 19th century. He lived for 100 years. He never left his village, but he was a citizen of 5 different countries in his lifetime. So this was a moment which very much basically the states were traveling. So this type of a much more global encounter, which is typical for the West European former imperial states, is very different from Central and Eastern Europe, where basically they have been produced, all our states, as the result of the disintegration of the empires. And the anti-imperial sentiment is very strong. And this is quite interesting to see now when, particularly in places like the United States, United Kingdom, but even now very much in continental Europe, the discourse of decolonization is replacing the Cold War as the major reference. Central and East Europeans, we don't find our place. We basically never had the colonial guilt because we believe that we have not been going anywhere. And as a result of it, from time to time, I had the feeling that East European, particularly more conservative intellectuals, in all these debates about decolonization, they feel kind of a Marxists in Africa in the 1960s, 1970s. You follow the big debate about the working class. The only problem is that you don't see the working class in your place. But this is intellectually, this is extremely, in my view, important to understand some of the particularities of Central and Eastern Europe. But otherwise, you're absolutely right. Many of the problems that we are discussing is also common to South Europe too.
Thank you. Yvonne, this comes from Professor Barbara Falk. I think you've met Barbara. She's one of, not just a friend, but our colleague. She teaches at RMC here in Toronto and a member of our center. And by the way, she's a leading expert on the study of Central European dissident movements. So the question is, I read your
very well her book, so no need to introduce her.
Okay, very good. I read your 2014 book on dissent with tremendous interest. If you had to update the arguments you made then about disruption in light of what you say today about demography, what would you add, especially in terms of the disconnect between electoral politics and protest anti-politics?
It's a great question, and thank you very much for this. I do believe one of the reasons that the young people can be seen quite often on the streets also of East European cities is that they don't have the numbers. There are many other reasons why basically the protest is the way this younger generation feel better represented in the democratic system. But if you compare the generational cohort of 1968 with the generational cohort of people who are now 20, 25 years old, numbers matters. This is a small cohort. In certain countries, basically, you can win elections totally ignoring the young people. So young people, in order basically to be politically influential, they should be not at the ballot box. They should be on the street. And this is why basically street politics is becoming critically important for this generation. Interestingly enough, in many of these street protests, I have seen this, of course, in Bulgaria, and I have seen it also in Hungary and other places, when people are protesting, the things that they basically try to make a point against the government said, if you are not going to succeed today on the street, we're going to the airport. So in a certain way, they're using the power and kind of the trauma that the exit is going to put on the nation in order to press the government to go for some changes. And from this point of view, of course, it's quite interesting to see that this dynamics between exit and voice, how it worked, for example, in East Germany during the 1990 events.
Thank you. And Barbara, greetings to you. This is from Isabel Davis. Yvonne, Isabel is one of my undergraduate students. She's taking a survey course with me in the history of Europe since 1789, and as well as another course in Europe, and also she studies Hungarian history. So here's her question. The identity of many countries in the region, such as Hungary, has been based off an us versus them mentality, especially using national mythology. I am wondering how successful this model has been towards younger generations in these countries. Do you see the younger population is willing to go against this mentality or follow along with it? Which kind of links a little bit with what you were talking about regarding Barbara's question.
Listen, it's interesting because on the basis of the studies that I know, it's also slightly when it comes to different type of rights and attitudes, the generational divide is different. For example, when it comes to migration, it appeared that in Central and Eastern Europe, there was not a major divide between the younger and the older generation. When it comes to sexual minorities, there was. Because simply, basically, the tolerance, knowing much more people who are gay or lesbian is much more normal for the younger generation. But to believe that in general, the younger generation is, as a rule, more liberal than the older generation is not something that is really proved by the data that I have seen, and particularly on the opinion polls. For example, strangely enough, when it comes to anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism is stronger among the younger generation than the generation of people after 60, 65. It's also based on a different experience. Also, this younger generation very much polarized in the way, particularly in places like Poland, which is highly polarized in a way. Poland, in my view, and Barbara knows more about Poland than me for sure, but it very much represents a political constellations not so different than the United States. And from time to time, and this is, I know that this is very much provocative, but I do believe that from time to time you can make an analogy and try to see some of the clash between Eastern Europe and Western Europe within the European Union on some of these political connections, not very different than the way you see between the red states and blue states in the United States. And some of them goes also with, as I mentioned, basically also the very important divide between the big cities and the rural areas within the countries. For example, Bratislava, Prague, Warsaw, Budapest, when it comes to voting, they vote much more similar to the Western countries than they vote to basically to their own countryside. And this is part of it. But no, I don't believe that you can easily say that nationalism as a rule is low in the younger generation.
Thank you. And Isabel, thanks for the question. Another one from one of my students, Yvonne. I've got quite a few questions here. Regarding foreign relations, as governments focus more intensely on the ethnos, does this contribute to a geopolitical shift away from multilateralism and put further strain on the European integration project? Could entrenched illiberalism likewise erode the transatlantic relationship and disrupt the security landscape? There's a lot in there, but a good question, Thomas. Thank
It's
you.
very good. It's a very good question, and this is interesting. And by the way, the pandemic also, strangely enough, affected these trends, because the pandemic in Europe was at one and the same time the nationalist moment. More borders have been closed because of the pandemic than because of the migration crisis. Suddenly people have been locked out in their national borders. But at the same time, during this 1 year, Europeans understood that basically European economic nationalism does not make sense in Europe. Even if the world is going protectionist, Bulgaria cannot go protectionist. There is no Bulgarian economy. All these countries are very much integrated in the European economy. Basically, Central Europe in general is part of the German industrial sector. So as a result of it, what is happening on the geopolitical level is that you have diversion of national strategy and national sentiments. Normally after 1990, particularly from Toronto or from Washington, you're going to see Eastern Europe as a place where the anti-Russian sentiment was very strong because of the Soviet legacy. And this was kind of true for a while. Now in Eastern Europe, you see a major divide between countries like Poland or the Baltic republics, who really very much see the Russian threat as critically important. And governments like Hungarian government or societies like Slovakia, Bulgaria for different reasons, which are kind of a much more Russia-friendly and not ready to follow in certain policies. So the return of certain type of fears and strategies from the period of the national formations is critically important to understand this. I am never going to forget, I was here 2 or 3 years ago in Turkey and talking to one of the Turkish ministers about what is happening in Syria, and he made a point which is always going to stay with me. He said, you should understand, World War II is over, but World War I has not finished yet. And this idea of kind of a returning and coming back of some of the old imperial spaces, the way you see the world in these terms, it is there, and it makes it very difficult for classical transatlanticism, particularly the one that had been figured during the Cold War and the post-Cold War period, to survive. And on the level of multilateralism, you're right. And also, even when you have some multilateral initiative, you are seeing more and more multilateral initiatives, but outside of the multilateral institutions. One of the things that in my view is absolutely striking of this last year is the lack of international cooperation as a response to a crisis that affects everybody.
I'm looking at, I have a big screen I forgot I could look at, Yvonne, which makes it's much more sense than looking at the tiny screen. This is from a prospective student. I have heard that large numbers of young East Europeans, especially Romanians, have been returning to their countries of origin during COVID-19. Do you think this trend will continue, or will people move back to Western Europe after the pandemic? Very good question. Thanks, Isabel.
Yeah, it's a great question. And honestly speaking, I don't know. Because it very much depends how the normalization is going to come back. Some of these people are not decided. For example, Romania, who is doing now quite better in economic terms, and obviously people see much more chances. Some of these people are going to stay, because what happened, and this is, we experienced this even on the personal level. In the end of February, the beginning of March, when we start to understand that they're going to be much locked down, and when everybody is saying stay home, when you ask to stay home, the question is, where is home? You can have 3 apartments in the world, but you can stay only in one of them if you lock down. And then we had a discussion with my wife and in the family where we'll go. And this was a strange discussion. She basically said we felt like a Viennese Jews in the late 1930s, where you're running. And the story was, of course, the Austrian hospitals are much better than the Bulgarian hospitals, and we knew this. But we also realized that in the moment of high uncertainty, crisis, having people around you speaking the language, your native language, creates a certain type of a cultural protection that is very important, which is not just the medical one. And secondly, probably the Austrian hospitals are better than the Bulgarian ones, but in Bulgarian hospitals, you have friends and relatives and classmates who are doctors, and you don't have this, for example, in Vienna. And we decided to go back to Bulgaria to spend the first 2 months of the pandemic. So I do believe that the calculation is interesting, and for many people, coming back was also the way to see the country with different eyes. We had this major protest in Bulgaria in the summer of this year. And I do believe that one of the reasons was many of the young people who came back was on the street was that for the first time they saw the country with the eyes of their parents. Because one of the interesting story about pandemics was that it put the generations strangely talking much more intensively, being together, nevertheless that they try not to touch themselves. So I don't know, some of these people are going to come back, some of them are going to stay. But this is the first big reverse of people in a big way coming back to Eastern Europe from the West. And I do believe this is quite important because it also shows that these migration flows are not just one-way street. And this is slightly going to reduce some of the fears. But when it comes to the medical doctors, when it comes to the nurses, the demand for the medical personnel in Germany is so big, and the money that they're ready to give and the opportunity is so big that in the beginning of last year, the Prime Minister of Albania went on television calling on the patriotism of the Albanian doctors not to leave the country, saying there is nobody to be able to treat your parents and your grandparents. So this can create also a major tensions between Eastern and Western Europe. Because I remember talking to an old lady in one almost dying village in Bulgaria, 8-9 people there. And we talk about Europe, and she said something that I'm never going to forget. She said, listen, I like Europe, but now it's more complex than before, because Europe is great, but they took from me two things, my grandchildren and my doctor. And this was quite interesting to see basically how this person, and because her kids have emigrated, the grandparents does not speak Bulgarian anymore. The fact that you cannot speak with your grandparents because you don't have a common language anymore, this is particularly painful for some of the representatives of the older generations. And some of them have been blaming Europe, and some politicians like Viktor Orban, but also Kaczynski, I do believe have been very much exploiting this.
Thank you. And but on a personal note, I have greetings to you from Kristina Stoyanova. And Kristina, I'm saying hello to you as well. Let's catch up by email. I've got, Ivan, a terrific question from a young man named Tomasz Iliev. And I know Tomasz reasonably well, although we've only encountered each other on Zoom, but he's coming to our center in the fall. He's living in Trenčín, Slovakia. And I found him in the past few months. We've been corresponding, a very good analyst of what's happening, particularly in Slovakia. So here goes with his question. I very much like the note concerning Central and Eastern European liberal voters moving westwards. As a Slovak, my grandparents were Bulgarian, following the situation in this part of Europe, I want to ask whether the migration of young, educated people is not more or less the result of low quality of education young people receive. Do you believe that popular politicians in this part of Europe are more oriented on catching the attention of voters, buying and admiring their populist claims? So it's kind of an education-related question, Yvonne, and about the low quality of education.
This was interesting because immediately after 1989, one of the major advantage of the post-communist countries was the relatively high level of education, and particularly the quality of the secondary education, not so much the university education, but the secondary education. It differs from country to country. Some of countries like Estonia are doing quite well. But for example, if you see the data for Bulgaria, this is really this is heartbreaking, honestly speaking. 44%, according to PISA studies, of the Bulgarian kids are functionally illiterate. They know the alphabet, they can read the text and they don't understand anything about the text. So what started to happen is that you have a big sorting out between kind of the winners of the education process, some good schools and others. And as a result of it, 83% of the Bulgarian students who graduate from the top 30 schools in Bulgaria even do not apply in the Bulgarian universities. So you have a story in which some of the best educated leave very early because for them it's very easy, they're competitive, they have get this education, while for a huge number of young people, the education is very low. So even if they decided to move to the West, they basically does not have much of an option. What is also interesting is even if you're not leaving the country, if you're young people, but if most of your friends has left, you're not going to take part in the political life in the same way. Because if you're always kind of struggling with the question to stay or to leave, for you, the question for whom to vote is not as important. And this I found very much. Also, I found something psychologically that is quite interesting. People who did well, for example, they started their middle business, they did a good work, they succeeded in life. But the fact that many of the people left make their success less important to them because they have why I'm succeeding in a place that others are living. And here is my major hypothesis. In places like Bulgaria in the 50s and 60s, migration from the rural areas to the cities was part of the industrialization, very much pushed by the communist government. And as a result of it, the very movement from the village to the town was already perceived as a social promotion. Something like this type of a logic I can see in 1989. There was a moment, I don't believe anymore, in which being a taxi driver in London looks better, but not simply in a money terms, but also in status terms, than being an engineer in Sofia. I do believe this is starting to change. And strangely enough, the lack of a vertical social mobility that came from 1989 was replaced by this horizontal mobility. Just by living in the West, nevertheless at what I'm doing, and nevertheless how successful I am, puts me in a better categories. I do believe that something is turning on this, and probably pandemic, going also to the previous question, is going to make this change visible to many people. This is now much more what I'm doing than simply where I'm living. And this is also connected to the fact that for many people also the idea that everything in the Western Europe, for example, works perfectly is not in the way it was.
Thanks, Ivan. This is from another one of my students, Timothy. And Ivan, just so you know, kind of diverse it was, we started out the morning, I was in a class with Timothy and we were studying Kadarism or goulash communism, and now we're on to something different. But Timothy has a question related to Hungary. Thank you, Mr. Krastev, for an insightful presentation. My question pertains to Hungary's diaspora. Hungary benefits from their diasporas in historic Hungary, both in foreign and domestic policy. We know how the current government has implemented certain policies to use this diaspora to secure their own political positions. But to what extent is it possible to say that the reverse is true, that the diaspora is in fact helping to shape the nationalist character of Hungary to emphasize their own role in Hungarian political life? In other words, is it possible to say that the ethnic majority characteristic of the Hungarian state has been emphasized by the diaspora, thereby contributing to the trends you explained? Wow.
Absolutely. This is it's absolutely great, great insight and argument, because if you're listening to Prime Minister Orban, if you see the fact that he's making all his most important summer speeches in Transylvania, not in Hungary, in a certain way, being a diaspora Hungarian, this is the real Hungarian. And this is an interesting story because in a certain way, and this didn't start with Orban. I remember Antal already in the early 90s saying that I'm a prime minister of 15 million Hungarians. What is interesting in this dynamics is the following. If you're living out of Hungary, most of the social economic issues, for example, issues like corruption, that are very much worrying people living within Hungary, the level of the social infrastructure, the level of the health infrastructure, it does not bother you. In a certain way, you're Hungarian because of your origin, because of symbolic politics. So yes, most of these kind of leaders and all this identity have been produced outside. And this is not a new phenomenon. It can be seen in many other countries where you're going to say the real, those who believe in the idea of Hungary are those who are not living in Hungary. This was true also, to be honest, in Bulgaria in the interwar period. So you're absolutely right that to a certain extent, the majority, the ethnic majority, is very much shaped by the views, by the experiences, and this type of affinity for symbolic politics, who is typical for the Hungarian minorities living outside of the country.
Excellent. And I've got a question, Ivan. We're probably going to take just two more questions, if that's okay with you. I've got one on email. I've got a question here from Robin Martin, who's one of my graduate students. And I want to read Robin's question, but I also want to kind of put something of my own into it. And I hope Robin will forgive me, but it's similar. So Robin writes, thank you for an excellent talk. My question is, in 2018 in Ireland, there was an influx of population and voting, mostly young people, for the referendum to legalize abortion in certain cases after decades of population decline and plateau. Do you think a return of young people like this could happen in Central and Eastern Europe? I mean, I think what Robin's saying is it can become transformative. And Ivan, if you don't mind, I want to embed in Robin's question something that I'm thinking about, because the leaders of Central Europe, and there was a piece in the FT today that wasn't that explanatory, they haven't done a particularly good job on managing COVID, right? That's point one. And point two, when I look at your book on Is It Tomorrow Yet? You know, one of the things that is a really important aspect of that book is that a lot of how we manage these crises depends on how much trust we have in institutions. And I think for me, what was laid bare in the COVID period is that Central Europeans still have very low levels of trust in their institutions. And that's despite 30 years of transition. I find that kind of disturbing and even depressing at the same time. So I'm asking you, do you think that the COVID situation will be transformative at the ballot box, given something that Robin said, in light of their absolutely abysmal handling of this crisis?
Listen, it's a great question. And I want to know, and this is interesting. When the pandemic started, the first 3 or 4 months, one of the surprises was that Eastern Europe was doing quite well. The number of the infected people was quite low. The number of people dying was much more low compared not even with Italy and Spain, but even Western Europe. Now, the Czech Republic is the country in the world where most people have been dying for 100,000 people as the percent of the population. So the idea of the failure of this government, it's failing everywhere. I was reading recently an opinion poll about Hungary. This is becoming a real issue. For somebody like Corbyn, and trying to make this the failure of the European Union and not his own failure, it's not going to work. And this is the problem. One of the story of Central and Eastern Europe was that it was not so much the redistribution of resources. Many of these governments were great on redistribution of blame. Whom to blame? And I can imagine that they're going to be a transformative effect. The only story is that we don't know, because we don't know when it is going to be over. And because strangely enough, one of the things that is really fascinated me about this crisis is that every 6 months, we're changing our view, who is doing well and who is not doing well. In the West, I do believe some countries in Asia, Taiwan, but South Korea, but even China for the moment are doing fine. But if you see, 3 months ago, the United States and the United Kingdoms were perceived as the end of the world. Then they bet it on vaccination, and because now the major story is the capacity and how many people you're going to vaccinate, suddenly United Kingdom started to work better than Germany. And of course, the United States is vaccinating with a very high speed. So this changing of position is very important because, as you know also, and this is one of my argument in the Corona book, is that in the moment when people cannot go on the street, in the moment in which you don't have really an opposition in the lockdown, where the parliaments are very much marginalized, one of the way of people to control their governments is by constantly comparing what is happening in their country with what is happening everywhere else. And when people like Orban are saying we're better Europe, see what is happening, not working anymore. And secondly, strangely enough, migration was the major issue on which politicians like Orban particularly were building their identity, but it was the infection that stopped people moving. So the migration suddenly lost its importance, and you cannot keep it on this. So I do believe that in a short term, there's going to be a major pressure. I do believe that Babic is going to have a very tough elections, repeating and staying in power of what is happening there. And I do believe that even Orban, who did everything to be sure that he cannot lose elections, I do believe the challenge for him to preserve his power is going to be much higher than anybody expected even 3 or 4 months ago.
Thanks, Ivan. That's my take on that as well. Ivan, we're going to do 2 more questions, and we're going to pack it in, and they're both from former students. Enes Alalov, who's from Izmir, in fact, he wants to ask you about the minority demographics in Bulgaria, especially the Turkish minority. How has it changed since Bulgaria became an EU member in 2007? The Turks who left in 1989, how many of them have been back now that things became almost worse in Turkey than in Bulgaria?
It's a great question. Listen, around 300,000 Turks came back immediately after the change, because there was not much time being lost between the expulsion of the Turks and the political change in Bulgaria. But after that, many of the Turks went to work in Western Europe, because paradoxically, Bulgarian Turks has one major advantage when they decided to travel and to work to Western Europe, because there was a well-established Turkish communities in many of West European countries, and because they speak the language. For example, for Bulgarian Turk going to look in the construction sector in Netherlands in the 1990s, it was much easier to find a job than of the Bulgarian of the same quality of education, because basically he had one language, which is a spoken language. Otherwise, the demographic dynamics and the profile, I mean, how many kids and how the family structure is of the Bulgarian Turks in Bulgaria is not very different from the majority population. And this is a very important point, because as Robert knows much better than me, one of the major stories with these demographic wars is not simply the size of the minority, but basically the demographic dynamics. And Kosovo-Serbian conflict was one of the greatest example of this. And of course, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was a great example of this.
Now we're going to come, Ivan, to our last question, then I'll say a couple of concluding remarks, and then it's coming into nighttime. It's only 6 hours ahead, but it must be heading towards dinner time in Sofia. This is from Jennifer Leclerc, a former Sarah student. Jennifer, we're supposed to be talking on the phone last weekend. I guess we're going to make it this weekend. Ivan, would you say that the opening of borders has made it easier for authoritarian governments in Central and Eastern European countries to consolidate power because of the exit option? Good point. Yeah. Those who do not support the policies of the governing party can simply move away rather than working to galvanize the population against the ruling party. You've written quite a bit about that, I know, Ivan, already.
Yes, I do believe, contrary to this one of the counterintuitive also results of my research, because I was doing this also on Russia. And one of the reasons why you don't need to basically exile a big number of the opposition figures to Siberia is that many of these people, being disappointed what is going on, they decide to leave the country on their own. So from this point of view, opening of the borders, which on one level, of course, is producing certain pressure of the governments, people are traveling, they can compare, but it also basically makes them easier to deal with the most active part of the opposition, because these people are much more ready to leave the country than basically to go into this constant war against the government. From this point of view, what Navalny did, basically deciding to go back to Russia, is not something that many people would take the risk, and you see the result, what happened to him.
Well, you know, we didn't, Ivan, we probably should have got to Navalny, but maybe that's the subject for another time we could talk, because, you know, for me, I've been following that more closely than I would normally follow events in Russia. And, you know, what the FT called Putin's, you know, I don't know if you saw that piece, you know, the third act of Putin, which is now you've gone simply to a hardcore authoritarian system. I assume that's true. But let's leave that for another conversation. It's 6:20 in Sofia, 12:20 in Toronto. It comes to me, Yvonne, to say that, and I've been getting so many, the problem, Yvonne, is not just talking on Zoom, but when you moderate the conversation on Zoom, you often can't follow the questions because you're looking at the questions being written. So it's a bit discombobulating for me. And then people email me, sending me different notes about how great the talk is, people asking for recordings, etc. I can't tell you anything more than that was a great morning for me. And I hope it's been a great early afternoon, evening for you. And on behalf of all of us here at SARAS at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and of course, on behalf of Mr. Damov, our mutual and dear friend, I just want to say thanks very much. I had a great day. It's always a pleasure to see you. I give my best regards to everyone in your family. I still remember that morning your son woke me up early dressed as a pirate when I was staying at your place. And he said to me in German, "Heute ist Piratentag." Like today is pirate tag. I think it was 5:30 in the morning, but I'm getting all these nice notes. Sarah Rutley, thank you for a great talk. Fond memories of my time at Sarah's. Thank you for a great talk. Yvonne, I see, it gets too emotional. Hold on a second. Yvonne, I got a hand up from Mr. Damov. Okay. Dan, are you there?
Yeah.
Dan, I see your hand. Did I not see? I'd like to hear from you, and I'm sure Yvonne would as well.
Well, Robert, what I want to say is that Ivan did a superb job, as I expected, and I congratulate you, Ivan. I'm delighted that you took the time to do all of this, and I look forward actually to reading a transcription of what you were talking about because it's so valuable and should be. So I wish you well, stay in good health, enjoy life, and continue your very perceptive analysis of the political situation.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dan. And on that note, Yvonne and I will just sit here so that our tech people, but that's a good reminder, Yvonne. These people who help us out here, in addition to Mr. Damov, who's our sponsor of this event, I want to thank Daria Dumbadze. You met at the beginning, Yvonne, and Adam Bell for helping me out in these technical areas, and they make a great team. And one of the reasons why we've transitioned to Zoom so seamlessly is because we work with really devoted and nice people. And funny too. Remember, we want smart, nice, and funny. This is our goal. So terrific. Ladies and gentlemen, it was a great crowd, a great audience. I thank you very much. Yvonne, we stay in touch like always. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was so nice, as if it was not Zoom. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao.